Welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I am Assembly Member Guillermo Linares, and I represent New York State's 72nd Assembly District, which includes Washington Heights, Inwood, and Marble Hill. The New York State Assembly recently passed a bill calling for the strengthening of rent regulations and tenants' protection at rent-regulated properties. Rent regulations will expire on June 15th, and this bill would add much-needed tenant protection. Here to discuss how this bill can help tenants in New York City are Ellen Davison, a staff attorney with the Legal Aid Society, and Jose Lopez, lead organizer with Make the Road New York. Welcome. I've been seeing the two of you a lot lately. Yes. It's nice to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
And this is perhaps the most critical moment for working families and for low-income families across the 5 boroughs in a long time. Not only have they been pressed because of a rapid displacement across all neighborhoods where they are concentrated. But on June 15 is the drop dead date. Certainly the anxiety is very high. We have little time to go. And so we want to discuss today what action are being taken. You represent 2 of the leading organizations really advocating on behalf of New Yorkers living in rent-regulated apartments. I represent the district with the highest number, 38,325 units in the city of New York. So the anxiety is very high, and while we pass this bill in the Assembly, we still wait to see what happens in the Senate. And the anxiety is very high. And I know that there's a lot of work to be done still.
So absolutely. As you well know, rent regulations cover 1 million apartments in New York City, 2.5 million people. And they provide protections for tenants, both in terms of how many rent increases tenants can get, as well as other protections. The problem is that over the years, the laws have been weakened, and they have incredibly huge loopholes that allow landlords to increase rents to unaffordable amounts, and also have built-in incentives that where if a landlord can empty an apartment of a long-term tenant, he gets a windfall. And we believe that this is part of the reason for the incredible rise in tenant harassment. Landlords are harassing tenants out of their homes and out of their communities. And it is our contention, it is our belief that the way to stop that is to strengthen the rent laws so people can remain in their homes and can afford to pay their rent.
Yeah.
So rent deregulation happened in 1997. I recall I was in the city council and voted against it. But it has had devastating impact since then to this day.
Right. Deregulation comes for most New York City apartments that become deregulated because the apartment is empty. And it doesn't really matter what the rent is. If the landlord can claim during that time that the apartment is empty that he's done enough work, or he can raise the rent enough to get it to the decontrol threshold, which is $2,500 now, he can deregulate the apartment. What's so dangerous about this time is he doesn't have to show his work to anyone. He doesn't have to prove that he's gotten there. All he has to do is say, I've done it and I've deregulated the apartment. Next tenant comes in, they have no idea that they should check. And so we've lost, we think within the last decade, 250,000 apartments have been lost to deregulation in this way. And it just has had a devastating impact on the neighborhoods in New York City.
So, Jose, I know that Make the Road has been working aggressively defending tenants throughout. So this is really critical where we find ourselves.
It's very, very critical. And when you talked about the anxiety opening up the show, you know, I'm one of those folks who feel that anxiety. I'm also a rent-stabilized tenant. June 15th has just as much of an impact on me and my wife than it does all of the members that we represent. And I was having a conversation on Wednesday night with Rosa Mendez, who's a leader at Make the Road New York. And I asked Rosa when she raised her hand, why are you coming up on June 9th to rally for the strengthening of the rent laws? And she said, I'm doing this for my community and my family, but I'm also doing it for the 3 tenants in my 6-unit building who have already been displaced. And then she told the story of 3L, 3R, and 2L, which is the building that she lives in. And in every single one of those units, since the building was sold in 2008, those families were either pushed out or bought out. Told me the story of one unit where the offer was $10,000. And of course, on the front end, that might sound like a lot of money, $10,000 to pick up and go. But the reality is that in a neighborhood like Bushwick, which we represent where she lives, $10,000 isn't going to get you past 3 months in the current rental market. And so that's exactly what she said. She said, I'm coming up for me, for my family, for all of Bushwick, because she's been living there since 1981, but also for the families who have already been displaced. And so what we're seeing is that there are a lot of tactics being used. We talked about some of the loopholes, but on top of that, we're seeing increased harassment and displacement of tenants in communities that for a long, long time, in Bushwick in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when my parents were there, and other Latinos from New York City were living in Bushwick, that was a community that was highly ignored. No one wanted to step foot in the place, right? And then now you see a hot market, right? You see a trendy neighborhood, and landlords and developers are trying to take advantage of that. One of the ways is by calling for the end of regulation, and we're losing communities across the 5 boroughs. And Bushwick is one of those places, and it makes us incredibly nervous, but at the same time, it gets us really excited about the opportunity to organize, because that's what we do. And we've been able to organize thousands of tenants across the boroughs to be sure that they're going to work hard, not just on this critical issue, right, protecting our homes so that everyone can have a respectful and dignified life and lead a respectful and dignified life, but also on many other issue fronts.
So the target on the part of property owners are also the most vulnerable. Seniors who have retired, live on fixed income, probably have been living the longest time in those regulated units and are most vulnerable. So is this something that you experience in your organizing throughout?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that question makes me think of Maria Elena Cuchay, who's a member of Make the Road, who has been living in the community for decades. And she is retired, and she is a member who's very active, very vocal, beautiful face to look at, always smiling. And currently her rent is just under $400, and her monthly income is just under $1,000. She's on that fixed income. And what the landlord is trying to do, and he has been successful in removing every other tenant in the building. So right now she's practically living in a construction zone. But what he's trying to do is raise her rent to over $1,000, which would mean that every single penny that she earns would need to be spent on rent, and she still doesn't have enough, right? And so that is what we're talking about when we talk about how critical this is. And the impact isn't just an impact on seniors. It's also when you look at the immigrant community in New York City, right? 50% of all rent-regulated households have immigrant families living in them. And when you look at the low-income immigrant households, folks are spending 58% of their annual income on rent. And so I want folks to think about that, right? When you get a paycheck, and every single paycheck, you have to take 58% of that to spend it on rent. And then you have all these other bills on top of necessities like feeding your kids, healthcare, your Metro card, which is also going up every time I read the paper, right? What are you left with? What are you left with? And so it becomes increasingly difficult for low-income families, for seniors, to remain in this city, which is a city that we've built. This is our city.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, any person who's a long-term tenant is at risk for displacement. Any neighborhoods where landlords see low rents is an opportunity, and they've come in and bought thousands and thousands of apartments, with the thousands of apartments across the city, with the idea that they're going to clear out the building and start with new tenants who hopefully won't know what their rights are, so that they'll be able to charge incredibly high rents. The other thing I always like to talk about that I think is really important about the rent laws and why it's so important to fight against deregulation is you don't only have rent protections if you're rent regulated. You also have the right to a renewal lease. And what the right to a renewal lease allows you to do is complain to your landlord if you have a leak. It allows you to organize with your your neighbors, to demand better rights from your landlord. If you don't have the right to a renewal lease and you start being the leader of your tenant association, your landlord's not going to renew your lease. Why should he? He can get people in who are grateful for having a home over their heads and aren't going to be agitating. That's why the rent laws are so incredibly important, because it does allow us to create roots in our neighborhoods and fight for better conditions for everyone.
Well, I'm very pleased that in the Assembly, where obviously there is a majority that understand how critical and important strengthening these laws are and protecting tenants, that we passed precisely a month before the 15th. It was May 14th when we passed the legislation, practically sending a strong message to doing away with deregulation and also protecting tenants while strengthening the laws. But we are the lower house. We are the Assembly. In order for us to have this law passed and the governor sign on, we need the Senate to really act on this critical moment on behalf of New Yorkers that will be impacted. So, I know that there is an effort to mobilize and to really have New Yorkers let themselves be felt. And I know that there's a strategy now at play, and we're all, part of that effort. I know the labor movement is very concerned with this. Tenants across the city are very concerned, and organizations like the two that you represent and many, many others are concerned. And, I want to thank publicly here the support of those who represent in the Assembly and those also in the Senate. Hopefully we will see something good happen in the Senate, who are outside New York City. This doesn't necessarily affect them per se, but they have been supportive. In the Assembly, they were supportive of what goes on when we pass the legislation. I want to publicly thank them. But I want to focus now a little bit on the strategy that we have leading to the 15th, especially the 9th, when we want to bring the voice of New York City tenants and the people who know how this will impact on every neighborhood that has rent-regulated units, that the voice comes and be heard, both especially nowadays by the Senate and by the governor himself.
Yeah. I mean, we are planning on going up with buses all across the city to Albany on June 9th, because we want to make sure the legislature and the governors hears the voices of tenants. We've done actions in the city, but this is the time for the mass mobilization for us to go where the people are sitting and making the decisions. It's about a week before the rent laws expire. We know where the Assembly is. They passed a very strong bill that protects tenants. The new leader of the Senate has not said such favorable things about rent regulations. The one person whose voice seems to be missing from the conversation is the governor, who's been fairly silent when it comes to rent regulations. Certainly, I'm hoping he, on June 9th, hears the voices of his constituents, the tenants of New York City, about how incredibly vital it is for them to have stronger laws so they can stay in their homes.
And we, you talked about our strategy in moving forward, and I would just say, we can't hope to get this done.
Yeah.
We have to get this done. We've seen what happened in 2011, and what we've noticed is that with the slight changes that were made, we've lost in just 3 to 4 years tens of thousands of units, and that means that we've lost tens of thousands of families in New York City. Right? So when we talk about units, we're talking about people who live in those apartments, people like my parents, people like your parents and your parents, right? And so we want to be sure that we humanize this issue and that we're understanding the impact that it has on everyday people. I think that the Assembly will hold the fort, right? And I think that's right. And we're counting on you as the Assembly to do that. And I think that we do have to be very critical of the governor, but also of the Senate. Particularly key leaders of the Senate who right now represent districts in New York City that have 20 and 30 and 40,000 units of rent-regulated apartments in their districts, and they have been silent on this issue, right? And so those senators particularly are folks who need to step up, who need to speak up, and who need to be vocal between now and June 15th to be sure that the communities that they represent are at the table once negotiations commence. And so this is, definitely about the governor, and we need the governor to move, but the Senate also has to move. And this is a key year. 2016, next year is election year. And it's also an election year where the national, the ticket for president and other national seats will be on the table, right? And so folks will go to the polls, and we will remember exactly what happens come June 15th. And if you're someone who has not been vocal on this issue, especially when you represent tens of thousands of rent-regulated tenants, the next year, you can't be upset when those very same tenants are at the polls trying to get you out.
Yep, absolutely. We have a lot of New Yorkers who live in districts represented by senators who are not the mainline Democrats. They're either Republicans or part of that other caucus, who have just been absolutely silent on the rent laws this year. And they represent tenants who are struggling. And I'm sure those tenants will respond based on how they act.
Well, aside from the mobilization to Albany, I know that something that works is when you go to the website of the New York State Senate, as you do with the New York State Assembly, and you look up and you find the email of representative senators. You could send a note to them. You could make them aware, particularly if you live in their district in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and let them know how critical this is and how you are watching as a voter, someone who pays taxes, someone who is part of the neighborhood and part of their district. I think that's a very effective way, as well as telephone calls that you make. A phone call is equal to 50, 100, 200, 300 people every time one constituent call. So I think that there are different ways in which we could let ourselves be known, and the most effective one is when you go and visit in the district office, in the neighborhood, and you just bring the message personally, how important this is to you. So I think that there are many ways in which you can, by picking up the phone or sending an email, but if you could go to Albany, I think that would be the most impacting, because you're bringing yourself 150 miles north to bring a message to the Senate and to the governor, and also to show that what we passed this month to strengthen rent regulation, it's important, it's critical at this moment when we see so much happening in the neighborhoods that we have, with displacement, gentrification taking place, and harassment of tenants, which is, unthinkable. Yeah. So bottom line is that, this is do or die for us, and it will be protecting working families for the next 4 years.
Right. if the bill that you passed, if we get all those protections in there, we will have the next 4 years to work towards something even better. So we very much hope that that is a bill that gets passed.
So if someone wants to go to Albany on the 9th, where do they, is there a way that they can proceed to connect in order for them to go? I certainly will be mobilizing within my district to have a strong contingent that day coming up. But I would encourage my colleagues also in the Assembly and the Senate to do the same thing.
Right. So there are housing groups across the 5 boroughs in New York City. And so one of the things that I would encourage folks to do is check in to see whether or not those housing groups are coming up on June 9th, and if not, encourage them to come up.
Okay.
We're part of the Alliance for Tenant Power, and as part of the Alliance for Tenant Power, we're going to be mobilizing many buses up to Albany on June 9th, and we will be more than happy to provide additional seats for folks who want to tag along. My email and my phone number, I think, will come up at the end of the program, but my email is jose.lopez@maketheroadny.org. My phone number is 646-496-3469. And folks, whether you know me or not, I'm very friendly. Pick up the phone, send me an email, and I'd be happy not only to be sure you have a bus seat to come up to Albany, but if you want to know where your district office is, if you want to know what the phone number to your senator is, I will do the work for you, and I will personally bring you that person's address and phone number to make sure that you put in that call. So that's my info, and feel free to use it.
Yeah.
So, as before we come to an end, I just wanted to have a sense of what is the best scenario that you would like to see come out of the effort to help convince the majority in the Senate to really step up to the plate and help New York City, because New York City suffers, the rest of the state suffers. That goes without saying. What is it that we would like to see from the Senate? What is it that we would like to see the governor stepped up to? We know that his leadership can be critical. It has been demonstrated before in critical moments, and this is one critical moment, not just for New York City, but the entire state.
Yeah, I mean, we would love to see the governor come out and acknowledge that we need to end deregulation and close the loopholes. I think it's absolutely correct to say that we are the economic engine of New York State, and especially for low-income people, every amount of money that they get, they actually spend in the local economies. And that's why it's important to raise the minimum wage. But the same is true with lowering costs of rent. And every single dollar extra that someone who's low income gets ends up going back into the neighborhoods, which creates economic activity, which, because we have so much economic activity in New York City, helps the state. So it would be great if that were something that the Senate and the governor would recognize, and certainly having the governor coming out and saying that the strengthening the laws is his top priority for the rest of the session would be amazing.
Well, I can say without any hesitation that for those of us in the Assembly, extending and strengthening rent regulation is #1 priority. Yeah. I want to take this opportunity to thank Speaker Carl Hastie, because he has really been unwavering on this, and he has understood that we in the Assembly, the Democratic majority, made this a do or die priority for us. I want to acknowledge also the leadership of Chairman Keith Wright, who chairs the Housing Committee, of which I'm a standing member, for his leadership in stepping up to this. But I want to publicly thank all my colleagues in the Democratic Conference for standing up and making a difference and sending the strong message that tenants in New York City are key for stability and for neighborhoods. We have been through thick and thin. Throughout, we have gone through difficult times, and now that the neighborhoods are safer and more attractive, tenants who have been there all along are now the target to be displaced, and this nothing could be more harmful to New York City than this. So I think it's great to have both of you here. I want to thank you, each one of you, for the work that you have been doing and the work that we still have ahead. I recall the panel that you both participated in the Somos conference up in Albany, addressing this precise issue. So again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a wonderful discussion, and I thank you both for being here and sharing your insights today. If you would like to discuss this or any other issue with me, please contact me at my district office or by email. I am Assembly Member Guillermo Linares. Thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.